Hi everyone, thank you for your interest in this webinar. My name's Ed Salter. I'm the Peatland Code Officer for the IUCN Peatland Programme. I'm going to take you through the changes we made for this new version for the Peatland Code, version 2, how we made them, why we made them, and I'll also spend a little bit of time showing you how to use things like the emissions calculator and peat depth template, just hopefully to alleviate any concerns about it being difficult to use. The Peatland Code and most accompanying documents were last updated in April 2022. That was version 1.2. And the main reason for this update, for the version 1.2 update, was to tighten the language and increase the guidance to satisfy UK accreditation services. The Peatland Code has to meet a conformity assessment for ISO 14065. And the changes from version 1 were inclusion of restoration validation and a separate guidance document. So for version 2, there's been some more significant changes. So why do we do updates? Simply put, we want to advance the restoration and protection of UK peatlands. And by progressing and developing the code, it makes it more accessible for landowners to fund what is often an expensive restoration process. And it keeps the Peatland Code in line with the latest science and carbon market developments. Prior to the release of version 2, only blanket bog and raised bogs were eligible under the Peatland Code. And that was simply due to available scientific evidence. DEFRA reports underpin the science, and we have to be confident in the available data to include, for example, something like fens. Any future iterations of the code will require the same confidence in the data. Before releasing a new version, we consult with leading peatland scientists, government representatives of the 4 countries within the UK, project developers, NGOs, peat partnerships, and our technical advisory board give insight and make recommendations to the executive board before the changes are confirmed. Creation of the supporting documents that we'll show you, they come from external feedback on what would help the process and kind of just from our own experiences of working on the day-to-day running of the code, such as the peat depth template or management and monitoring form. So changes for bogs, where minimum peat depth was once 50 centimetres, it can now be as low as 30 centimetres, provided you evidence that the peat depth between 30 and 50 centimetres, the peat used to be deep and it's part of an area of deep peat. So it can't be continuous shallow peat. This brings us in line with our minimum project length of 30 years. And seeing as we expect the bogs to degrade at 1 centimetre per year if no interventions are in place. So that makes it 1 centimetre per year, 30 years, 30 centimetres. You can evidence historical deeper peat by using methods such as soil coring or historic peat maps. And the reason for needing evidence is because scientists are only confident that the emissions factors are valid for deep peat and peat that was once deep, so nothing shallow by nature. Another change we've made is that peat depths are only required to be measured up to 1 metre. And the thinking behind that is similar to the 30 centimetres, is that we have a maximum project duration of 100 years. And for bogs, as we assume an average loss rate of 1 centimetre per year, 1 metre is the maximum required. Projects may still want to and are very welcome to measure the full peat depth, however. And project length isn't calculated by average peat depth, but by 75% of peat depths being over the minimum peat depth. For mapping, you continue to use a 100 by 100 metre grid, but when a measurement is less than 50 centimetres deep, you increase the measurement frequency to 50 by 50 metre around the shallow point until the measurements around that shallow point have a peat depth of over 50 centimetres. I'll be showing you this on the template shortly. After it hits over 50 centimetres, then you can revert back to the 100 by 100 grid. The reason for putting this in is that in putting 30-metre buffers and drains around the hags and gullies, the 100 by 100 metre grid wasn't deemed enough to ensure that no shallow peat was included in that buffer. So we wanted to move to 50-50, 50 by 50. But after consultation, it was deemed a little too time consuming. So as a compromise, it's 50 by 50 when you hit shallow peat. It is an example from the field protocol, just showing the increased measurement frequency based on peat depth. All right, so here's an example kind of screenshot of the peat depth template. I entered the data into the 100 by 100 meter column you see on the far left, all in green. If anything was going to be below 30 centimeters, then it would not show in green, it would be white. Once you hit the measurements of the shallow peat, I've moved to 50 by 50, and then once you hit the deeper peat, I move back to the 100 by 100. And if you look in the top of this graph in the blue section, you'll see it calculates the percentage of points over peat depth, which will help you calculate your project duration. So whatever percentage reads over 75 is your project duration. So for example, if any number of your columns showed over 75% all the way up to 60 centimeters, then at 65 it drops to 74%. Your project duration would be 60 years. For version 2, modified is now an eligible baseline condition category. It does come with some stipulations, however. So unlike actively eroding or drained, projects are not eligible for pending issuance units from the start date of the project, but only after the verifier can classify the area as re-wetted, modified bog during verification in the future. The PIUs will then be issued for the rest of the project length and verified at the same interval as other PIUs. This change was made because the difference between modified and re-wetted modified bog is mainly vegetation composition, which wouldn't change straight after restoration, and it can't be held to the same timescale as other categories. Vegetation change can take years and in some cases may never be achieved due to, for example, air pollution. This is why when completing the emissions calculator, which I'll show you shortly, you won't be able to include modified in the calculations. If you plan to restore and hopefully receive carbon credit for modified bogs, however, you do need to include the area in your project map and in your peat depth recordings that define your project length. This is an example of the change in emissions factors from pre-restoration to post-restoration. We calculate carbon reductions by calculating what each condition category emits in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and it takes into account different warming impacts of the different greenhouse gases. In the Peatland Code, we include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, particular organic carbon, and dissolved organic carbon. The project then identifies the amount of hectares for the condition category and is input into the emissions calculator. The emissions factors for version 1.2 came from a DEFRA funded report, and with more data gathering on peatlands, our scientific understanding of these systems increases, so we need to keep that up to date. And version 2 now realigns with the UK greenhouse gas inventory and the latest scientific evidence. So therefore the figures have changed. And verification will always happen to the latest numbers. So any verifications happening this year, we're due our first one in June and will be verified to version 2. And it's to keep the Peatland Code robust. And you know, some of our projects run for 100 years, so we shouldn't be using 100-year-old emission factors. So here I've posted an example emissions calculator. This is table 1 and 2. Table 1 on the left, obviously. So as you can see, I've entered in project details into the smaller table. It's also where the project would account for GHG leakage. So if, as a result of peatland restoration activities, a project has any intention to change use or management of land elsewhere within the same agricultural landholding, it would need to carry out an assessment to determine whether the change will result in significant GHG emissions. And if they do, the project quantifies the leakage in the leakage section, and it's subtracted from the projected emissions reductions, but the calculation works that out for you. In here, table 2, I've entered the condition category and hectarage. Then I've selected the condition category change based on the field protocol guidance. This is table 6. I've skipped over tables 4 and 5, which are the assessment, unit, and cumulative emissions reductions tables. They don't require any information input into them. The tables go all the way to 100 years. So what I've done to fit my project length is I've deleted everything up to 55 years, which is what we asked the projects to do. And you can see the figures provided, which is the net reductions, the 15% risk buffer contribution, and the claimable emissions reductions, which is net reductions minus risk buffer. So a major new addition to version 2 is the inclusion of fens. And fens are areas where peat is formed, which is fed by surface and groundwater, containing nutrients from the underlying geology in which it has been in contact with, as well as rainwater. There's a wide range of fens, and we've identified 4 eligible baseline conditions. Cropland drained, grassland intensive drained, grassland extensive drained, and modified fen. For cropland and grassland, these can also be on bog, but projects would also always have to follow the fen field protocol. The inclusion of fen came after a DEFRA report led by UK CEH, with also scientists from James Hutton Institute, University of York, University of East London, and Scotland's Rural College made a paper titled Aligning the Peatland Code with the UK Peatland Inventory. And there's also been consultation with fen experts, and we followed our usual governance process of the Market and Investment Forum and Technical Advisory Board and Executive Board. So by including fens into the Peatland Code, we open up potentially 450,000 hectares of UK land for restoration. The minimum peat depth is 45 centimetres, and the minimum duration is 30 years. It follows the same logic as for bogs, except that we assume a loss rate of 1.5 centimetre per year. And we arrived at this following a fen literature review. The big difference for bogs is that water table measurements are also required. So the field protocol has defined ranges of minimum and maximum plausible effective water table depths for each fen condition category. Now, the reason behind adding water tables is that for the inclusion of modified fen, there's not enough data to come up with an emission factor, so a water table has to be used. It was a strong recommendation from scientists to use water table for all fen sites and to use it to calculate fluxes. So it should also be noted that emission factors in the field protocol, they're only for indication. The actual figures will be calculated using a fen emission calculator, which I'll show you through now. Right, now I've had to crop and screenshot a lot of these because the fen emission calculator is very, very detailed. So I advise you obviously to go and have a look at it and play around with it. But I'm giving you the kind of information that you would need to input if you were a project or creating a project. The fen emission calculator is developed by the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and it also had data input from the James Hutton Institute as well. It can look a little bit tricky, but it requires the same levels of information for the bog emission calculator. The work will be done in your peat depth and water table assessments, following the field protocol. So I've snipped a few shots. This is on the opening page of the calculator. Very simple. You input in your area under consideration, duration, and start date. And here I've entered the original land use, and you would select from a drop down the land use and the water table average, which is also in the field protocol, but it has here the minimum and maximum. And then you would do the step change to your final land use, including your peat depth and water table depth. So here is an example of some of the information that comes out of the total project details. It also calculates per hectare as well. As you can see, it shows us the original carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, and then it adds them together to calculate the total emissions. And it also shows the total change emissions, including the greenhouse gas balance contributions and changes in emissions by gas. So as I was saying, they're also emissions by hectare, and they also show 5-year transition periods as well. This is the total emissions calculation. Or was this on the same page? And I'll show you the final project details. So this one is the final summary. And as you can see at the top box, I've completed another assessment unit just to show that you can have different condition categories for the same project. And this looks very similar to the bog emissions calculator. You can see on the calculator itself, there's a good deal of useful information, some of which I didn't get to cover in this. But all you have to enter is the essentials, same really for the bog, but also you're adding in water table depth. So changes for additionality, the process has been trimmed down somewhat. So in version 1.2, there were 4 tests. But after consultation with FTech, to our environmental economics group, tests 3 and 4, which were economic alternative and barriers, have been removed. Barriers was removed after we realized passing the first 2 tests, there's unlikely to be no further barriers that could or would be identified. Test 3, the economic alternative, was removed, but a lot of the requirements from that have been retained in test 2. So you still have to show whether a project would be financially feasible without carbon finance. Another change is the phrasing for test 2. So whereas in version 1.2, carbon finance was required to fund at least 15% of the project's restoration and management costs. Now we've rephrased it to no more than 85% of the project costs over the duration are covered by income other than carbon finance. And this was altered to place emphasis on carbon finance and not public funding. 85% might seem like a large figure, but some of the projects are high risk, so they do need that security. And we're looking at reducing that figure in the future, but we do need, for example, a carbon price guarantee. Consultation is and was a part of the Peatland Code eligibility process. To validate a project successfully, projects have to show they've proactively engaged with local communities. For version 2, however, the consultation process has been strengthened to historical features. Peatlands can act as an archive of our cultural past. And so after our own consultation with Historic Environment Scotland, to be successfully validated, projects have to show that scoping work has been undertaken to identify heritage assets and steps taken to protect and, where possible, enhance these assets. and proactive engagement with relevant parties has taken place.